welcome back, Jayne Monaghan.
Thanks.
So, so we did a podcast in last year, isn't it?
Yeah, last year.
And I think it got really good views. I mean, I think it got over 2K views now.
Oh, that's good.
So which is good. I mean, which is good for your CV as well.
Yeah.
So like, tell us about your experiences in New York so far.
Yeah, well, I mean, I moved here about a year ago to start my master's in international human rights law. I mean, England is very similar to Scotland and Northern Ireland. It's just a lot more English people, obviously. A lot more people wearing English football tops, which I was not used to in Scotland. That was not something you saw. But like Northern England is lovely. People are really similar. The culture is really similar to home, so it didn't really feel that different. But I mean, in my course, so my course is very small. There's only about 24 of us, and there's kind of like people from all over the world, all different walks of life. A lot of it is a lot of people working already in the field of human rights, so that's actually been quite nice. You get a lot of, it's like a lot of older students that they come to York as part of it's like part of a scholarship that the university run for human rights defenders. So I would say it's quite different to Dundee in that the postgraduate experiences, there's a lot more international students, so you get a lot more cultural differences and you hear a lot more about human rights things going on around the world. A lot of them are lawyers, they're activists, so that's been quite nice. It has a really big human rights center that they do a lot of activists, they do a lot of stuff for scholars. A lot of scholars come visit here and then they go back and they obviously they continue to work and the links kind of continue. So there's a lot of space for activism on my course. Like there's a lot of experience to get involved and help with even like designing campaigns, doing research into different violations around the world. It's been quite good because I'm getting a lot more experience in the very niche issues that are happening in specific states. So like we have an activist from Tanzania, we have an activist from Kenya, and you hear about the specific things that are happening on the ground from their perspective. So that's been quite interesting, rather than just hearing about it on like a macro global scale from like the West looking in. You're getting a lot more of activists looking out and then telling us what's actually happening. So that's been quite good and quite nice.
I mean, tell us a bit, you know, like, I mean, when people move from one city to another city, I mean, you are still very young. I mean, how daunting those earlier days are?
I mean, they are quite daunting, but I think for me, it's slightly different because I've already done it before. So obviously I moved from Northern Ireland to Scotland whenever I was 18 anyway. So it was daunting in the same way that it was the first time, but I think because I've done it before, it was less scary in a way because I kind of knew what to expect. I mean, it's lonely at the start. You kind of have to force yourself to go out and do things and make friends, which it's not always the most comfortable situation. But I think because I moved, my experience is probably going to be a lot different for new than other people who are going into the workplace because I was coming from one university to another. There's a lot of space and room to make friends on a university campus because everybody's doing that. Like it's a lot easier. I think the transition was easier because I was going back into education just in a different place.
What's your experience so far with York? So if you compare with like Dundee's campus and the York campus.
The York campus is huge. It is massive. Like it's on a scale that I didn't realize existed. It's because there's two big campuses. So there's a huge West campus and then another huge campus about a mile away. And then there's like a whole other like sports center thing that it's just mind-blowing how much bigger it is. But then I think one of the things about Dundee was because Dundee was so small, you knew where everybody was and like everybody was just kind of around because we were all on one campus. You could see a lot, and there were less students as well, but you kind of knew everybody, at least by your fourth year you know most of the campus by then. So I mean, it's a lot. I would say there's less of a feeling of community just because it's so big, especially postgrads in York. There's just so many of us that you don't know anybody. So I would say bigger in size, but I'd say it's a lot more daunting than Dundee was, because obviously Dundee, it's small, you know where things are, you kind of see everybody on the campus every day. It's different. It's definitely different.
So, like, what's your take on York overall? Do you think this is a city you can make your life even?
I mean, it's beautiful. It's like the cobbled streets, like the George, like the housing, everything in it is stunning. For me, I would say no, just because, like with Dundee, there aren't a huge amount of jobs going for new graduates. I could see myself living here because, in terms of what it's like for me, York is quite like home, because it's quite rural in the sense that there's a lot of countryside outside of it. It's not a very big city, but I would say that, I mean, it's quite expensive, particularly for younger people. But I don't see myself staying here in the long term. It was lovely to live here for a while, but I think unsustainable in the long term, especially for someone who's just getting into the job market now in the next few months. I don't see myself staying here. I think I'd like to, but I think I would like to move to like a bigger city where there's just more to offer than York. It's lovely, but it's very small.
Yeah. I mean, York is quite touristy as well. So during the summer, it's
it is
crammed with like all those
yeah.
tourists.
I tend to avoid York on the weekends now. I will not go in on a Saturday or a Sunday, because if I need to pick up a prescription, it's not happening. Like, I've got to fight my way through the tourists. I mean, it's nice because it's really busy and there's lots of pubs and there's lots of markets, and there's an atmosphere to York. But if you're trying to do everyday things, it's really like it's crammed with tourists. It's quite hard. It's not as bad now. It was really bad at Christmas time, because obviously there's Christmas markets and like it's very pretty, but it was hard to get about at Christmas time.
I mean, like, how easy to get like jobs, like especially for the students, because of that, it's a touristy place, so lots of,
I mean, there's actually quite a few part-time jobs going. I have a job here, but I was able to get a job because I have a car, so I could drive to, like, there's a big outlet that's kind of just outside the city, which I drive to because I live on the very edge of the city. So because I can drive, it was a lot easier for me. But I mean, it's quite easy for students to get jobs here, I would say, because obviously there's loads of touristy shops, there's loads of weekend work, evening work, there's loads of bars, there's clubs. I mean, it's kind of the same in a lot of university towns where there are a huge amount of students. There's just going to be a huge amount of pubs, clubs, like little shops, coffee shops, things like that. So it was quite easy to get a job. Part-time job, I'm not sure about full-time employment afterward. That is proving to be a challenge in York.
Yeah. I mean, to me, it's like, it's like UK's Florence. No, Florence is for the tourists, not for, like civil servants or like,
Yeah, that's not what York is for.
No.
Like York is not for the office worker.
No. But it's a good place to study, to, learn.
Yeah, it is.
Friends. I mean,
yeah.
And also
huge. So like it's been a lovely place to live.
I mean, especially the whole landscape is just unbelievable.
Green, lovely.
I mean, Scotland is good, but when I was in like West Yorkshire, I mean, it's just unbelievably beautiful.
Yeah, and one of the things that I have noticed since moving here, it's so warm. Nobody else agrees with me who is English. But it is so warm here compared to living in Dundee. Dundee was freezing. Northern Ireland was very wet. Here, quite nice. It's just been quite nice.
Yes, it's kind of like York is not like London. London can be too hot.
Yeah, and so I don't.
York is in the middle.
Yeah, York has been like warm enough that I can go outside without a coat, which is something I never experienced in Dundee. From September to June, it's actually just a bit freezing, with a brief period in about May where it's really hot for no reason. Then it's cold again.
In terms of your study, because I know you are very good in education. So how things are so far?
Well, I'm currently I'm doing my dissertation at the moment, so it's due in September. So I'm almost finished. It's actually what I was doing earlier this morning. It's been quite good. I mean, what I've noticed the most about masters is that there's a real like pullback in terms of like contact time with lecturers. It's a lot more, you kind of go off and you do your own thing. We don't really have set essay topics. It's kind of like you find a topic, you pick a title, you write what you want. That like there's a lot of independent learning, which I actually quite like, because there are certain things that I'm really interested in. So I've just kind of spent the whole year shoehorning that into essays, shoehorning what I want to talk about into essays for the 2 semesters. But I mean, at the moment, obviously, you know, there's a lot of issues at the moment with overpay disputes and things like that for like lecturers, particularly like those on 0-hour contracts, and there's not really a lot of security around that. So at the moment, we're in the middle of a marking ban. Like we had a lot of strikes, and now we're in the middle of a marking ban. So I'm kind of in a position where I don't really know how I'm doing, because I haven't got anything back since February. But I mean, they had like this marking ban and the strikes is completely fair enough, because they need fair wages and they need job security. And so
but also this is not your fault, you know. But also, you know, the way the university's bosses are behaving, I mean,
it's unfair.
Just atrocious. I mean, I think even like yesterday the meeting broke down. So basically, you know, but the problem is, I mean, academics they're good people, kind people, you know.
Well, yeah, they're
they only fight when you push them to the wall.
Yeah, well, this is the thing. I mean, already, like one of the things that's quite common with lecturers is you'll get emails back from them at 2 a.m, and like they never keep to their 9 to 5 anyway. Like they're always going beyond. They're always doing more than they probably should be, because they care. Because nobody goes into academics for the money. They go into it because they care. And absolutely. It's one of those things that I mean, I think I'm in quite a different position than potentially a lot of the older students. I know, particularly students who aren't UK based beforehand, get quite upset and quite annoyed about the marking bans and the strike. But I think because I'm quite used to the strikes for now, because they are not paying university lecturers as they should be. They're not paying the lecturers, they're not paying the assistants. Like there's just a lot going on in the higher education system that I'm quite used to, and I know quite a lot about anyway. So whenever it happens, obviously it's a bit annoying for me, but I mean, at the end of the day, I'm gonna get my degree either way. So it's one of those things that I know it's not my lecturer's fault, and if I wasn't being paid correctly, and if I didn't have the correct amount of like free time, free hours, if I didn't have proper pension schemes, I would strike too. So I know that about myself, that if I was in the shoes of the lecturers at my university, I would also be striking. So it's one of those things that it's a bit annoying for me, because I don't really know, I haven't got any feedback. But I mean, I'd rather they strike and get fair pay than I get feedback and then them have no sense of job security. So it's one of those things that.
Tell us about your dissertation topic.
So I don't have a working title yet. I know that that's probably stressful, but I will have a final title when I finish the conclusion, is what I have decided. So I'm currently my dissertation is looking at whether or not the UK's response to the Ukrainian refugee crisis was unduly preferential.
Oh, okay.
And I'm looking at the UK's own domestic legal culture whenever it comes to immigration and migration and asylum. I'm looking at their compliance with things like the Refugee Convention, and then I'm looking at global trends in how the convention is being interpreted, how that kind of has changed over time. And then I'm looking at it in comparison to the 2015 crisis, not so much, but kind of in a wider contextual way rather than a true comparison. But I'm basically looking to see whether or not it's legal to treat different groups of non-nationals differently, and whether or not it's fair, basically, is what I'm doing. And I'm kind of looking at what the UK have done for Ukraine, why it's such a vast departure from previous experiences with asylum and migration. And the reason I'm doing it at the moment is because you probably will have seen there's lots of talk at the moment about the illegitimate boat people, and the Nationalities and Borders Bill came in 2022, about 2 weeks after Britain opened the doors to Ukrainian refugees through the various visa schemes. So it kind of seems like if you look at all of it in context of the legislation that's being passed that tightens border controls, it doesn't make sense why the UK have responded so positively, so in line with convention standards in this context, whenever previously they haven't. So I'm looking at why that might be.
Because you did my Middle East politics course, isn't it?
Yeah, I did.
Are you bringing any Edward Said stuff here?
Yeah. My final chapter is all about theories of nationalism, like Orientalism, and kind of why people perceive different groups differently, and why, because you could look at my first two chapters all look at the law, and they look at domestic law and international law and all of those things, but realistically, law doesn't exist in a vacuum. So in order to properly assess the law, you need to look at the cultural and political context the law exists in. So I need to talk about Orientalism, because there's so much literature in refugee rights about good refugees and bad refugees, and why there is this idea of the other and like the foreigner in a lot of media discourse, and how that potentially impacts the lawmaking in terms of asylum. So one of the big things that I'm looking at is like ethnic affinity in lawmaking. So there's this idea that Ukrainians they're European, they're our neighbors, they're white, they're Christian, they're Western, whereas other groups, particularly within the 2015 refugee crisis, they weren't. There was a complete cultural difference there, and it's all about like the lack of understanding, people equating different cultures. So like you saw a huge amount of ideas of the 2015 crisis as the terror threat. So that's the idea of confusing Middle Eastern culture with like jihadist extremism, and the complete lack of understanding of what different cultures look like, and just the fear of that. So I'm using your course a lot.
I did a podcast with one of the, actually, I mean, he's actually a lawyer as well. He's a professor in one of the American university, but he was trained by Kimberly Crenshaw, who was involved in America's this idea about othering, because he got like a couple of sections very good. I mean, he kind of analyzed Edward Said thing with the like contemporary context, how the America, and it's not only America, it's like how other countries are following the suit.
Yeah.
But at the same time, what you are saying with the Ukraine, it's totally different discourse, isn't it?
Yeah, it's kind of the other side of it, where you're looking at, there's this idea of othering, but if you have an other, there is an us as well. So it goes back to, I did a course in third year about theories of nationalism, and it's like the idea of like an us versus them in nation building, the idea that in order to create a nation, you need homogenized citizens. So that whole idea of homogenization and seeing yourself reflected in other people, that's one of the reasons why there's so much, like why there was an outpouring of support for Ukraine, because you look at them and they look like the regular British citizen. They look like we expect Europeans to look. They're European, they're similar. Whereas you look at other refugees from other parts of the world and you don't see yourself, and then that's a big part of like the perception of what refugees are plays a bigger role into how we feel about them, and then how we feel about them impacts how we legislate around them.
I mean, because that's the whole point about human rights, isn't it? It will deal with human, not like, categorize them. No, okay, you are not that human. You are a bit, less human. So it's I mean, the news, I mean, I feel really, disappointed the way the news media kind of run things every day in UK. I mean, with this like latest thing, they put the migrants on a barge.
Yes, I've seen it.
It's quite symbolic as well, isn't it? It's like public execution. It's like 15th centuries, medieval world. People are asking for, we want to see public execution. So this is like visual. I mean, when a society accepts that position, this really, saddens me. I mean,
yeah, that's one of the big things that I talk about in my dissertation, where I'm kind of talking about there's a big culture that you're seeing shifting towards closing borders. We've been seeing it for the past decade, as long as like that more general shift to the right that we're seeing in politics anyway. And obviously what you see in a lot more right-wing politics is the idea that moral obligation ends at the border, and like, we don't want foreigners, which is quite funny because obviously the UK's entire system is built on immigration. The UK is very multicultural, so the entirety of the system is built on welcoming in migrants because we need them. But yeah, it's that kind of idea that we don't want any people that don't look like us anymore at all. Like you saw it with Brexit, but this is just a continuation from there.
This whole situation is nothing to do with like anything. It's just politics. It's just winning the election. And
yeah, because
like,
it's illegal.
Yeah, because people are fearful and and
yeah,
exploiting those fear.
That's exactly what it is.
Yeah, and if you look at these people who are running the show, they're quite international. I mean,
yes,
they've got investment in all over the world. They've got friends all over the world. But
they're
then
really different.
Tell the other story here that no, they're not good people. So
yeah. It's one of those things that I remember we were talking about this a lot in one of my courses, where obviously what you're seeing at the moment is that obviously the Conservatives know that there's a very high likelihood that they're not going to win the next election. So this really hard on borders is something that they know that their core, like not even their core, but their periphery voters who are kind of on the edge because the cost of living is rising, they're kind of reverting back to that nationalistic us versus them idea where they're saying, well, look what we're doing. If you vote for Labour, they're going to open the borders and we're going to be overrun. We're not. But they're doing this thing where they're pushing through this bill. It's the illegal Immigration Act. It won't pass in the courts because it doesn't comply with European human rights law, and it doesn't comply with a lot of international conventions. So it actually won't get signed into law because as soon as it goes to the courts, the High Court will say, no, this is uncompliant. You can't do this. But the general public don't know that. So the government is just doing this. It's all for show because they can't actually do this in the long run. It was like the whole plan to send field asylum seekers to Rwanda. They can't do it. They can technically send them to a safe third country, but they can't send them to Rwanda because Rwanda's not safe. So they just do it because it's a bold move. We're taking a hard stance on immigration, which is something they know that people are fearful over, and it's something that it's like a classic political move. It's the same thing that you saw that Margaret Thatcher did whenever there was a huge pushback against her government. There was a war in the Falklands, and all of a sudden patriotism was back. It's the same kind of tactic where you drum up old fears, you drum up that like nationalistic idea that we need to protect our country, protect our borders, and that makes people forget about the everyday issue that they have with the government, which is the cost of living crisis. There's no doctors, there's no nurses, there's no teachers.
It's the way they are, doing politics. It's becoming a kind of wasteland every single day. I mean, what the hell is going on here? I mean, they know. I mean, this is so bad faith politics. They know that this will be not going through the court. They know it. But then they can say to the public, do you know what? We tried our best, but these leftist lawyers, leftist judges are stopping it.
It's just polarized politics. It's like, I mean, like I could bring Northern Ireland into it because I always do, but it's exactly the same thing that happens in Northern Ireland every single time. A political party takes a really hard line on something they really don't need to, and then they make it a partisan issue, and then it doesn't matter what happens because they'll just blame the other side for it, regardless of whether or not they were in the wrong. It just becomes but the other party, it's their fault, it's not ours. And it's the same thing that you're seeing occurring more in Britain, where there's just a huge polarization, where you're seeing the two parties pull farther apart.
But also, do you think, I mean, there are winners and losers as well? I think the losers are the mass, the population itself. So, like, if you look at the Northern Ireland's politics, it's not like, the political leaders suffered. It's just the public.
No, we haven't had a government since 2017.
So, like, they blame each other,
Yeah. but like, you know, it's the DUP's fault, it's Sinn Féin's fault, it's everybody's fault actually.
Yeah.
But people don't care because people, whenever you start doing big issue politics, like things like the border and like immigration in the UK and in Northern Ireland, most things are big issue politics because everything has been politicized. But if you go back to the UK context, as soon as you start bringing in big issues like the border, like immigration, people will forget about the everyday politics of the cost of living crisis. You know, there's less money going into the NHS because the government's saying, well, look at what we're doing with immigration, because that's such a buzzword. It's just like that fish barrel politics where like you're hitting all the big buzzwords and people forget about the everyday things because they're so stuck on the big picture that they forget, oh, well, yeah, this government is really, they're hard on immigration, and I don't want loads of immigrants coming in and taking my job when your job isn't paying the bills because the government aren't allowing for pay rises and the cost of living crisis is skyrocketing. It's like a cognitive dissonance that you're just seeing.
Because, I mean, did you remember that documentary we watched during our fourth year module, Middle East Politics, The Power of Nightmare?
Yes, I remember parts of that.
So that's like going on, isn't it? It's just like people are just fearful. Oh my God, what's happening? So it's just like 6 people are coming to UK through like channel. And that's a big issue when, like, you know, we are talking about serious problem with NHS, serious problem with pay, serious problem with our housing. Everything is just going down, you know, over last, I think, 50 years. But it's not, that's not the issue. The issue is like 6 people are coming. We need to stop them, which you cannot stop them anyway. So
if there's anything that if there's anything that the big, like the Nationalities and Borders Act has proved, is that we actually can't stop people coming over. But also, because I'm doing so much research on it, not as many people are coming over as what it seems to be expressed in the media. Like, I think I was looking at the figures, the amount of Syrian refugees that came over. There was this big outcry that we were going to have too many Syrian refugees. 20,000 came over in the course of 5 years. That is barely anything. Even in comparison to if you look at any of the other countries in the EU that accepted refugees, the numbers are not comparable. It's and the idea, it's because there's that politics of fear. It's the idea of, oh, millions of people are going to come, but they don't, and they won't, and they haven't.
I mean, especially like 2 things, like it's not only the fear part, but also the part of, you know, becoming that person and accepting that position. Your country is doing this, you know, inhuman things to the people, the fellow human beings. I mean, how will you reconcile that position? So, I mean, I struggle that bit more that, you know, I mean, each time I open the newspaper, the first page is like, you know, this barge, this steamer. I mean, it's like, for me, it's like kind of dystopia. It doesn't happen in normal world.
No, but then the problem with that is most people don't see illegal immigrants, failed asylum seekers as people. They're not people, they're illegal boat people. They're not individual people who have specific context and reasons for leaving. These aren't people who had families and lives before. They're nameless, faceless masses of people who are climbing over the edge of the border to get in. That is the problem. It's just I'm actually looking at a lot of this at the moment, and it's because in media, like a lot of what you see in the media, you never really get individual stories of migrants. You just get, even in pictures, there's very rarely pictures of just one person. You get pictures of about 60, like it's usually men as well, young men, because that was a big scare point in the 2015 crisis. It's usually pictures of upwards of 10, 20 young men all together, usually not dressed the best way, usually presented in quite a negative way in pictures. So that's the image a lot of people have whenever they see failed asylum seekers. They don't recognize that each of those 20 or 30 young men is an individual person who has a reason for fleeing the country that he did. I mean, I also think there's a general idea that people don't really understand refugee flight. They don't understand how difficult it is to get to the UK, how far these people have actually come. And like, there's just no human factor, the human factor, is completely removed whenever you're talking about refugees, because you're not talking about people who have fled thousands of miles. And the reason that they're emaciated, the reason that they look the way they look, is because they have been through horrendous conditions to try and get somewhere where they feel safe. And I mean, people are always saying, like, there's this big idea that they're coming to steal our jobs. Why are they coming to the UK? And I'm like, well, they're coming to the UK because for decades, the UK has presented itself as a place of safety. And it's a place where life is good, life is better, you can get a job and make a life here. So it's not really the fault of someone who has been told this through global media, that the UK is a brilliant place that will accept you. So really, like, especially whenever the doors were opened to Commonwealth countries, there was a huge flood of migration here. So it's not really the fault of people who have this image of global Britain, it's a great place with a great system that can help you get back on your feet, for wanting to come here whenever they have fled, because in their mind, the UK is safe. So if you want to present your country as great and good and safe and affluent, then you shouldn't be surprised that people want to come here if they feel unsafe in the countries they've been in. It's a natural pattern where they think, I know this country is safe. I want to get there because I'm not safe. It's the human element is completely removed whenever people are talking about refugees. It's not there. It doesn't exist.
I mean, especially like one of the things you mentioned about, this like individual stories. These stories are nowhere, anywhere. So even if you look at a popular, even BBC Question Time, if you look at the panel, who are this panel?
Well, that's
I mean, so I mean, public is totally kind of blind spotted that you will never know the story, what's going on there, because you don't need to, because I know more than you. So we know about Iraq because 10 Downing Street talks about this.
And because it's not talked about in the news, because obviously, like, there's that saying, like, a week is a long time in politics, things move on. So there is never enough time in media to cover what is actually happening. Say, even in the Taliban takeover of Afghanistan, it came and now we don't speak about it anymore. The same thing with women's rights in Iran. It was spoken about for a little while, it was really hot, and now it's gone. And it was the same thing with this, like with this new, I can't remember what they're calling it, it's like a center or something for migrants on this boat. Next week, that'll be gone. There'll be something else, but it'll still be there. But because unless you're really passionate and really interested about it, you're not going to go looking for it. I'm in a different position because the entirety of what I do at the moment is all about refugees. That's all I read about. It's all I think about. It's all I do all day.
No, because I mean, that's the whole point, because you are becoming an expert,
Yeah.
So that institutes, public policy kind of come back to you to know your expert's opinion about that, rather than going to like Nigel Farage to talk about, like migration policy. I mean, so obviously he has got his own idea about migration policy.
Yeah, he's wrong.
I mean, it's quite a funny story, because I was traveling all over the UK. So I went to Canterbury, and Canterbury is close to Dover. And it's a beautiful, beautiful city. But also in Canterbury, there's a place called Margate, and Margate is Nigel Farage's constituency.
Great.
You can see like his selection of the place, because he knows that people are, because they face those things every single day, and mobilizing those people. I think that's so bad faith politics. I mean, and if a society does not understand that, I think that's not good, obviously, but also it can bring lots of collective trauma eventually, and everyone will suffer for that.
But it's just migration. It's not even the policies. I mean, the policies bother me, obviously, but it's the way that people outside of, like, really, I mean, I'm kind of in an echo chamber at the moment, because I'm in a human rights law, so everybody agrees with our opinion because we all take the same views. I mean, a lot of people in my course obviously are quite left-leaning. That's generally what you find in human rights spaces. A lot of people are really left-leaning, so a lot of us tend to have all the same views, and we're all thinking, how could people think this? But then whenever I because whenever I tell people I do a master's, a lot of them ask what my dissertation is because it's dissertation season. And whenever I tell them, their reactions are very different to a lot of people in my course who think, oh yeah, 100% it's unfair because, but then a lot of other people will be, I'll talk to them and then they'll say, well, it's not unfair. Ukraine is different. I'm like, Ukraine's not different. It's actually exactly the same. And that's one of the problems that I'm finding in like academia. We all share the exact same opinion because we all read the same literature and we're all doing the research. So we all, especially on my course, like immigration is a really hot topic on my course. So we're all doing a lot of the research. But then you go outside of that and people whose only form of information comes from large stream media, or even worse, social media, they have very different opinions because their media is different to the media I consume. It's so funny how different the opinions are as soon as you go out of academia and into the world, whenever like regular people are just asking you about your dissertation, and my dissertation in particular, because mine is a controversial topic. People have such different opinions.
But at the same time, it should not be controversial. It's just,
no, it shouldn't be.
You were talking about humanity, isn't it? Equal rights, you know. I mean, what's wrong with that? You don't want equal rights in the world.
But then I think it's quite funny because I always joke whenever somebody asks about my dissertation, I always joke that my dad and I have been fighting about refugee rights, the first refugee since the war in Syria broke out when I was 11. So we've been fighting about this for a decade, and I'm going to win the fight. That's what this dissertation is about. And I always say that, and then people will always inevitably lead on to a conversation. This happens to me while I'm at work. Like I will be serving someone. I work in a jewelry shop, so I will just be serving a customer, and then I will get a rant about immigration.
Yeah.
Because they ask me about it, and I make that joke, and they don't like that joke. I think it's a funny joke. My friends don't.
I mean, I've got this funny story. Like, I mean, because my brother-in-law used to run a big restaurant in Scotland, and I went there for a meal one day. It's like more family thing. And then suddenly, you know, like this immigration raid happened in the restaurant.
Great.
So, you know, everyone is rounded. And I was saying that, I mean, do you want me to stay here as well? I says, yeah, everyone. I says, I'm a British citizen, you know, so this is my passport number, you know, if you want. You know,
yeah.
I'm showing my mobile phone. So obviously they just ignored me, totally ignored me.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, it shows, you know, it's not about human beings, it's about something else going on here, isn't it?
Yeah.
So they have got very political things. These people are empowering some political motives rather than doing any justice for the society or anything. You know?
Yeah.
It's quite traumatized. You know, I was like kind of locked up there and seeing the whole thing. I mean, nothing happened. It's like 2 hours, you know, total waste of time. And also, like, you know, because I was speaking over the phone to my partner Poppy, and Poppy was worried about that. What's going on? And she was in do you want me to come over? Because I mean, it's just nearby. And my nephew was sitting outside. I mean, he was in Centers University during that time. I mean, and his dad, the owner, and we were all locked up in that big building.
Yeah.
By these people for like 2-3 hours.
Yeah, for what seemed like no real reason, and then they left, and it was just fine.
So, I mean, what they are trying to do is more about cosmetics things they tend to do rather than the actual problems, you know, actual problems about war, about our greed, about profit, about business.
Yeah, they don't care. It's one of those things that, especially with things like migration, it's just a buzzword because they know that people care. They know that it gets people angry and it gets people riled. So they don't actually care about doing anything about it, because if they did, the legislation they were putting through would actually be viable. It'd be legally viable and it would work. And it would, I mean, I say probably, it would hopefully be compliant with international standards towards human rights. I say hopefully because all the legislation that's been put through previously isn't anyway. But it would be, if they actually cared about that, then they would be doing something productive toward it. What they're doing at the moment, it's just performative politics
Yeah.
for the sake of an election to stay in power. That's all it is.
Because the problem is like, the departure of UK from the international, human rights
Yes.
legal frame is so difficult. If they, I mean, that doesn't make any sense either. If they're out from those international framework of human rights, then China and Russia, what they will tell about us?
Yeah, I mean, like, we're saying all of these things about like historical enemies, about Russia doing all of these horrible things, and about like how evil China are to their own citizens. And I'm like, well, do you not see that there are parallels just simply because you have always been the historic good guy? You've always been the historic West that fights for human rights until it's inconvenient for you personally. And then all of a sudden we don't care about human rights. But I find it so funny because obviously a big part of my dissertation is talking about the European Court of Human Rights. And a lot of people, whenever I talk about it, they say, oh, well, Europe doesn't have anything to do with us. And I think, well, we're still in the Council of Europe and we still have to adhere to the European Human Rights Court, that we're still part of that framework. We left the European Union, we didn't leave Europe. We're still very much in.
I mean, these are two different things as well.
Yeah. And people don't know that. And that's also a problem because nobody told them that in the, like, all of it was like taking back our sovereignty. We had sovereignty before. Even whenever we were in the EU, the UK was still so much stricter than everywhere else in Europe in terms of borders, because we were still allowed that autonomy. Even in European courts, the court will always rule in favor of migration control. The court allows migration control. It's a reasonable control measure. So there was never we were never forced to take in more migrants, more refugees. That was never something that ever occurred in the European framework at all. But people don't know that. It was just that, like, what was happening was they were being told blatant lies or half-truths, and they were just accepting it because a politician told them. And that's a problem.
I mean, especially when you talk about, when you were saying that you are in an echo chamber of human rights. So, but at the same time, these are academic things we are talking about. These are the experts' opinions, experts' writings, experts' books. But on the other hand, the whole mass is in an echo chamber as well, but that's something else. It's totally antithesis about what you are learning from the university.
And I think that's why it's so frustrating, because whenever I talk about migration, I'm coming at it from someone who studies it. I quite literally spend hours of my day every day doing this. And so whenever I say things and people say, no, that's not true, I just think, well, yeah, it is. I promise. And because it's different, because my point of view, which is based on empirical fact, is different to what is being spoken about on social media, which is, social media is my enemy whenever it comes to things like migration and asylum politics. I don't like it because people just say things and then everybody else thinks it's true, and I don't like that. And like me, so there's so many different levels where the problem is, unless you go looking for the information, it's not there. And it's actually really hard to find a lot of information on statistics and numbers. They're really, really difficult to find, particularly comparable numbers across different states. So the entirety of the UK is hearing one specific narrative that is coming from a government that is partisan. So it's not coming from objective fact. It's coming from a very partisan point of view, from a particular political party that is trying to stay in power. And so there are so many biases there. But because that's the only voice, because it's so hard to find that much information, and people probably don't care as much as someone who studies human rights, who is in the field of human rights. They just don't care as much because it doesn't touch them in a way that it like touches someone who works with the literature, who works with a lot of people who have experience with the asylum system. So unless it's that unless it touches you personally, people just aren't going to go looking, and that's the problem. And the government is banking on that fact that people aren't going to go looking for the information because they're too busy doing everything else.
It's quite funny, like, you know, this, like, because you are a practitioner, you are becoming a practitioner of human rights, international law. So, I mean, I have a student, I mean, when I was in London this year, she met me and she was telling a funny story because she works for an advertising company, very famous advertising company, who actually brings all those people, like models from all over the world, the top models. And she has to take care of their immigration, the visa, and all those things. And sometimes some of the colleagues make just passing comments about, even like, you know, if someone needs to fly from here to Dubai, and so then do they need like Schengen visa for that?
Yeah, it's just people don't know. You're like, well, of course they don't. It's not your.
I mean, the worst thing was if someone flies from Scotland, does they need a visa clearance?
Oh no, do you know? The amount of English people that don't know Northern Ireland is in the UK is actually upsetting. Because obviously, I mean, so whenever I was moving here, I was trying to get a job because, I mean, I needed one. So I needed a part-time job. And I remember the first thing that my employer asked me was, do you have the right to work in the UK? And I was like, I live in the UK. I was born here. Northern Ireland is in the UK. And even if it wasn't, Ireland, all Irish people still have the right to work in the UK anyway. How should you not know that? It's so annoying because the amount of educated people, like people in my course that don't know Northern Ireland is in the UK is actually really upsetting. Like it actually really upsets me. It actually makes me really cross.
Because I mean that's the problem. If the knowledge, the proper knowledge is not there, then you can actually harm people. You can dehumanize them.
Yeah, I mean, like obviously that's just a funny thing, like that is constantly happening to me here. But I mean, if you apply that to a context, so it's like one of my friends on my course, she's from Afghanistan, and like whenever people talk to her about Afghanistan, it can literally come across as the most insensitive thing. I've witnessed it a couple of times whenever we've just kind of been talking with other people. People will ask her the most horribly insensitive questions. And I'm thinking, if you had any idea about what's actually, like, if you stopped looking at Afghanistan as like a country where you know bad things are happening, and you remember that this young woman's family live in Afghanistan and she has family members there, like you can't just casually talk to her about the Taliban takeover of her country whenever her family live there and just think it's fine. That's really upsetting and hurtful to her specifically. Like it's one of those things that if you don't know, you can say things that are so horribly insensitive without even recognizing that you've done something to hurt that person. And it's awful.
Because the problem is if you do that, then the problem is then the states are always, you know, bad actors.
Yes.
They always try to maximize their position. And if you have got this kind of understanding about the state can do serious violence against these countries because these are, you know, like really
they're not real
primitive
people.
Society, you know, so these people don't understand about, you know, civilization and all those big things. And these people can actually harm us. But historically, though we harm them, but suddenly they will harm you.
Yes. And it's one of those things that because people don't know anything about these other states, they don't see. And I mean, it is just Orientalism. Everything comes back to it. It's the idea that people think the Middle East is this desert that is just full of people full of just women wearing full hijab and just not being able to work, and there's men like selling things on the side of the road, as if they're not developed states, or at least they were before war completely destroyed their infrastructure. It's like if you look at Syria today, there's nothing there. It's been destroyed, but it hasn't always been that. Like even if you look at places like Lebanon, like there's a reason Lebanon looks the way it does. It's not just because the people there had absolutely no concept of how to create a society. It's because it's been destroyed by conflict and by war. And I mean, it also doesn't help that Europe hasn't really seen domestic war since the 40s. So that we really haven't seen widespread destruction on that scale across European states, the way that you're seeing in the Middle East for more than half a century now. So there's no real concept in like modern, in like the modern, like modern memory of what that would be like to live in those states, where even your neighboring states are also going through conflict, and it's not really safe anywhere you go. There's no concept, particularly in the UK, because the UK hasn't seen domestic war in centuries. It hasn't. So there's no concept of what that would actually do to a person and what that would actually look like. And so it's really easy to just say, oh, that's it's not real, because you've never seen it, you've never experienced it.
It's quite funny story. I was doing a podcast with his friend. He used to work for IT sectors in America. So it's quite funny guy as well. So he was talking about his father. His father was a former army colonel who used to work in India. So he still remembered, because he was a very young boy, when like India got its independence, the partition and all those crises happening on the TV news. So he was really furious on his, drinking whiskey and saying that, because we left, that happened, So he's got no idea that, first of all, why you were there. So, I mean, you can see like when these individual immigrants come through this channel, it's the story did not start from, like Calais. Stories started in like Damascus or like Baghdad or like, Sana'a in Yemen. So if you don't tell the whole story, then people will never understand.
Well, that's the problem. It's just that people, the story starts whenever they enter the Mediterranean Sea, and they don't exist before then. There's no concept of these people having to travel for years. These people potentially, because obviously the majority of refugees, whenever they leave the state, they flee into neighboring states. But what happens whenever the neighboring state isn't safe? Like, what happens whenever you flee into that neighboring state and that neighboring state then falls to violence? Because that is what's happened for a lot of Syrian refugees, particularly. Like, say they fled, a lot of them fled to Iran, but then whenever they went to Iran, they faced mass discrimination there. So then they moved on. There's no concept of, there's no understanding of what is actually happening in home states and why they're coming to Europe. And the problem is regionalized insecurity. It's not just Syria or just Afghanistan. The fighting and the insecurity is spreading over because it's a regional conflict at this point. You're seeing hotspots pop up everywhere. So what happens whenever you move from one unsafe state to another unsafe state? You keep going until you find a safe one. And the problem is they can't even conceptualize what safe is by that point, because they have been on the move for so long. They will just keep going until it feels like they can't go anymore. And for a lot of people, there's that idea of the UK, we have a health service that will take care of you. There are jobs here. It's safe here. And that's why they're all trying to get here, because the idea of the UK on the global scale is it's this utopian place, which is so untrue, but it's this utopian place that will take you in and it will look after you. But that's just not. But that's why the story didn't start on a boat. It started in their home, thousands of miles away.
But also like things like NHS and all those things broke down long before they came here.
The NHS has been broken for decades. Yeah, it's the fact that nurses don't get paid and junior doctors don't get paid.
And also there's not much investment there.
No, because they're trying to cripple it.
I mean, my personal story, because I always bring like, our lived experiences. Like, I think last 4 or 5 years, I just called my GP just once. And do you know what my experience was? I called him that, I was feeling really unwell, very flu and cold. And then do you know what he said? He says that, why did you call me? Why did you call us?
You're like, I'm sick. What do you mean?
And then he says that, do you understand, if I take this call, NHS will fall apart? It's just like, what the hell is this? But I kind of sense like he's also, frustrated about the whole situation.
Yeah.
Because the amount of these kind of things happen every day to his professional life, it's just unbearable for him.
Yeah. And then the problem is COVID happened and COVID took out whatever was left of the NHS. It put it under so much stress and so much money was spent trying to deal with COVID that now there is none left.
Yeah. And like the amount of money lost as well,
Yeah. Just from silly things. I remember that. My mum was a nurse. My mum's a nurse. And I remember they bought scrubs, but the scrubs didn't work. So they had to just throw them all out. And like I remember this and I was thinking that is so much money just to wait like on one mistake and it's gone. But I mean, I've had quite a similar experience with the GP. So whenever I moved to York, I kept my GP at home.
Okay, that's
But
good.
I kept my GP at home because my mum is a nurse in the GP practice. And so it's a lot easier for me to get access to my doctor because my mum just knows him. I kept everything at home because I thought I'm never getting a doctor because I am chronically sick. Like I get chest infections every single year. And I knew that if I moved my doctor to York, I would never get seen. And then I would get pneumonia. Realistically, that's what would happen to me if I didn't get seen by a doctor. And rightly enough, I got a chest infection this year, like every year, like clockwork. But because I phoned my GP and he knows me because I'm always sick. So I told him and it was sorted right away. And like my mum picked up my prescription and it was fine. But that's only because I have an inside line with my GP. But like even before, whenever I was calling the GP for something else, I hurt my back, and I was trying to call him. I remember sitting in my kitchen with 4 phones. I had my mum's phone, my dad's phone, my phone, and my brother's phone, all calling the GP just to see which phone would get through. Like mum and I were both doing it at the kitchen table, and we were just like frantically clicking through all the phones, trying to see which one would get picked up first.
Yeah, I mean, you can see like the doctors, I mean, nurses, they're supposed to be the kindest people in a society, isn't it?
Yeah.
And when these people are angry, so something very much wrong with that society.
Yeah, they've run out. They've got nothing left.
Nothing left there. The bigger picture is like this situation we are creating for this country, all those foreign invaders. I mean,
yeah, got to keep them out.
Sometimes I feel that, one day perhaps people will see that how hollow the whole thing is. Because, I mean, how long this can sustain, the whole myth, years after years. I mean,
but then that's the problem. I mean, it's like that whole thing of like the myth of the American dream. It still exists, but it's not real. There's these. I'm actually doing a lot of that at the moment in my dissertation because it's all I think about. But it's that whole idea of like you create myths and symbols about your country whenever the reality is totally different, but people will just continue to believe the symbolism and like the myths all around what your country is like, and it's just they will never believe the reality over the myth because the myth is nicer. The idea of like the stupid things you will do for your country and for your religion, it's ridiculous. The amount of silly things that people will do and people will believe because they think it's for the greater good of their country or their god. But like actively it's harming you as a person, but you don't care. And I just think that's mad because that's how politics works at the moment. Like you don't care that your life is falling apart, but like you do really care about immigrants trying to get in. But that doesn't make any sense. Like practically, it makes no sense.
That's your like cognitive dissonance, isn't it? Like,
yeah.
You are very, very Christian. You care about your God and everything, but also you hate your neighbor. And like the way the US's politics right now going on. If you look at the Donald Trump's, competitors in the Republican Party, they're actually worse than him.
Yes.
I mean, some of them are just like outright racist.
Some of them are worse, but they're worse because they're also smarter than he is, which is scary. Because for all that he was bad, he was quite stupid because he would just say things that but like what's scary is you see it whenever it's disguised behind like political talk and it's disguised behind these buzzwords and there's a real like insidious nature behind it, but because it's disguised and wrapped up all nicely in like political buzzwords and like protecting our neighborhoods and all of those things, it's seen as fine, but it's still the same root.
And like First Amendment and all this bullshit. I mean, I mean, like what does it do? I mean, which group of people will be protected by these things? So we know that Trump will never be in prison. If a poor guy did all those things he did, I mean.
Oh, he would never get out. He would never see daylight again. But that doesn't matter because Trump is rich, he's white, he's a man. And because all of those things, he's famous and he has such a big backing. Because of all of those things collectively, nothing will happen. He's untouchable. Like, what are you going to do with him? Worst comes to worst, he leaves America and goes somewhere else. He'll be fine. I get into so many fights with Americans at this university talking about, particularly whenever we're talking about like conflict in the Middle East and America being in the Middle East. If I talk about God forbid, I talk about the Iraq War. Or I talk about like Afghanistan, or I talk about any of those things. It does not go well.
No. But also the problem is, when you create that echo chamber in a mass level, and what it does, I mean, it's quite dangerous model it create, and then it can harm serious amount of people, not only the outsiders but also yourself as well. So it's not like you will be the winner. Eventually everyone will fall apart.
Well, it's like the perfect example is American gun control. It's the idea that it's their right to bear arms, but it's actively negatively impacting your right to life. I mean, it's endangering the majority of citizens. But why do you want that right? It doesn't make any sense. The idea that it's their right to have it, but it's a bad right to have because it's actively putting you in danger in a way that you don't need to be in danger. There is no need to have what you have. Civilized society exists for a reason, and it's so that you don't need to defend yourself from someone just coming into your house. You don't need to defend your land. That's not something that should not be a modern consideration for you to have in a democratic system that has like an organized police force, and that is not a consideration that you should have in a modern society. That's not something you should be actively afraid of. Obviously lock your doors, but like beyond that, you shouldn't need a gun. You shouldn't want one.
I mean, my problem is that the more philosophical, like, the very people you are afraid of, historically, you have been a threat for them.
Yeah.
Throughout the history. I mean, like, Noam Chomsky is quite good in one sense, because people always ask him, all those like ticking box question that, do you believe that's a genocide? Or this is a genocide? It says that, before that, I want to see the whole list of the countries who did actually genocide. Because then you have to put America on the top list. And then there's no answer for that, because you see, because you just don't see yourself that there's a serious problem with you, mate.
I mean, it's the same with every country. There's like such a view of exceptionalism where like you are so unable to think critically about what your country does. And it comes back to that idea of nationalism, that your country is great, yours, and they would never do anything bad. But they have. Almost every organized Western state has committed war crimes at some point in the last century. It's not even farther back. It's the last century. The majority of Western states have, by the definition, if you look at the definitions of war crimes in the Geneva Conventions, most of them have committed them at some point. And it's such a fallacy that the idea that, these things don't happen in the West. They do. We just have different words for them. It's like even in America, whenever you're talking about terrorism, and mass shootings are never described as terrorism, but they are. What else would you call it? Terrorism is a politically motivated act that is specifically supposed to instill fear. What else is a mass shooting? What else would like shooting up a gay club be, except a political statement used to create fear? That's what it is.
like, I mean, that American friend, I mean, so he actually lives in Scotland now. If he's a bit elderly, so he fled from America. He thought that if he live in America, American, the structure, the health
Yeah.
system will kill him anyway. So even like our NHS is breaking down, he think the East is much better than that.
Yeah.
So, and then I try to explain, a couple of things. We talked about war on terror. If you look at America's war on terror for 20 years, they went after like 12 countries. These are the poorest of the poor countries. And they spend $8 trillion. So this research has been done by Brown University. It's like big research done. So like when you spend $8 trillion, $8 trillion is a serious amount of money.
The amount that you cannot conceive. Like
It's just unbelievable money. So if you just like give that $8 trillion everyone in America, everyone could have, got life.
You could have had free healthcare.
I mean, but the problem is, did you see the mass like misunderstanding about what's going on in their name? Because these are taxpayers' money, isn't it?
Yeah.
So the taxpayer did not ask like what really actually happened.
Yeah.
With that, like how did you spend $8 trillion?
What did you spend it on? Like, what were you doing?
And what did you achieve? I mean, what's the spreadsheet? I want to see the spreadsheet.
Nothing was achieved.
I mean, this is just like, it's just last 20 years history. The atrocious thing they did. I mean, like one of the stories, they built Afghanistan's armed forces by spending $87 billion. $87 billion. So when America left Afghanistan, if you see the last moment, do you know how many soldiers left with that $87 billion? Not a single one. Just vanished.
Yeah.
Because the whole thing was built on something else, isn't it?
Yeah.
Just ticking boxes. So most of the money went to all those, military industrial complex, all those military contractors, which are basically their friends, mates, So it's just taxpayers' money being transferred to the private pocket.
Yeah, just being lost. It's just, it just disappears. But because you've slapped that word war on terror on it, people don't ask questions. Because as soon as you put terrorism in, as soon as you talk about 9/11, war on terrorism, immediately people don't care. Because they don't care what you were doing. It's justified because it's protecting our borders and it's protecting the world, and America is fighting for freedom. Nobody knows what that means. You can't fight terror. How are you? What is the war on terror? You can't fight a concept. Fighting for freedom. What is freedom, though?
Whose freedom?
Yeah, who are you fighting for? What are you fighting? What is the goal? What is the end result? These questions don't have an answer.
What you said, that all the symbolism, things like flags and everything, which what it does, I mean, these are not innocent. It creates that collective amnesia about your empire, that we are the good people. Especially like the Brown University's like statistics are quite horrified. Their minimum estimate is that $8 trillion cost like over 1.2 million civilians' lives. I mean, we don't know what these people, families, the children, there's no story about that.
The rest of them become refugees. Like,
yeah. So I mean, when you spend $8 trillion, did you see how much damage you can do?
Yeah, you created a refugee crisis that hasn't stopped, and now we're not letting them in. So where are they going? You destroyed the country has been destroyed largely because of Western influence has played such a huge amount of the destabilization of the Middle East.
We can talk hours on those things. This is quite frustrating as well, because this will never reach to the people who really need to know about these things.
Yeah.
Because like Brown University's research, it's not posted in like BBC headline or like New York Times.
That is never going to be on CNN. The American public are never going to know.
No. Either you have to go to university doing a postgraduate degree.
Yeah. Like I'm 5 years in. Like I'm 5 years into this.
And we are very small number, isn't it?
Yeah.
You are talking about the billions of people really into this, really into spending money rather than, that what this will do. I mean, so if you just like sit with some kind of common sense and just talk to like, how does it work? Can you actually spend $8 trillion
you know, like critical thought.
I mean, if you ask American citizen, okay, here's the situation. We'll spend $8 trillion on this destruction, or if you want, we can, give that money to our society.
You can have the money back, in a tax break if you would like.
They even didn't bother to ask the citizens,
No. Well, it's one of those things that it's like there are certain issues in politics that everyone cares about, but nobody knows about.
No.
And war is one of them. Counterterrorism is one of them. Immigration is another one. Any kind of international relations, people really care about it, but nobody knows about it.
Mm.
And like even whenever you talk in the UK about the NHS, everybody cares, but nobody actually knows why it's hemorrhaging money. Nobody takes the time. We always talk about the NHS failing, but nobody really takes the time to ask the government, well, why? Like, why is it failing? What are you doing? Specifically, where are we losing money? Those questions are never asked because people get stuck in the big concepts and they never ask about the little things. Because obviously, if it was happening in your own personal life and you were losing lots of money, you would probably, if it was your business and you ran the NHS, but if the NHS was a small business and you, like the taxpayer owns the business, you would be looking through the business and thinking, well, why is it losing money? What can I do? But that's not happening because people are getting lost in the big ideas and they don't get bogged down enough in the small details that matter. It's the same thing with like foreign politics. Everybody cares about wars, but nobody knows what's going on. Everybody cares about Ukraine, but nobody actually knows what is going on in Ukraine at the moment because it's no longer the news.
But also the way they try to glorify war as well,
Yeah.
Like it's quite a funny story. Do you know like how long the attack of Pearl Harbor is?
No.
What's your guess?
Like how long it went on for?
Yeah, Hollywood made lots of films on Pearl Harbor, isn't it?
It can't have gone on for that long because it was just bombing, wasn't it? Like aerial bombs.
The whole attack was just close to 1 hour. Just right. 1 hour.
Then America dropped an atomic bomb.
2 atomic bombs.
On Japan. On civilian populations. Yeah, there is no comparison, but it seemed like a fair retaliation. But it wasn't. Because it wasn't.
But the story was told in a different way, totally different way. Because with us, Americans, this mindset, the narrative is, oh my God, they attacked us, they destroyed our country.
Yeah.
I mean, Pearl Harbor is like 2,000 miles away from America. First of all, the first question will be, I mean, how the hell you got this land?
Yeah, it doesn't belong to you.
So, I mean, it's just like 1 hour attack.
Yeah.
And then you can see how the empire reacted.
Yeah.
It's unbelievable. So like, I mean, when that 9/11 happened, and then like how your empire will react. So you have to be very careful, otherwise everything will be taken away from you. If you look at American society now, all kind of problem, the opioid crisis, no healthcare, nothing. It's just for the poor people, there's nothing there. I mean,
no.
And then you really went after those wars. And the Ukraine war going on, it's just no way you can stop this war anymore.
That conflict is now being managed, and it's just going to continue to be managed, because realistically, you're at the point that majority of Western powers will just continue to fund the Ukrainian war. So realistically, they're not going to lose the war, but Russia probably won't stop either. So it's just going to continue. It'll just grind to a stalemate where you have the next 50 years of people. I mean, it's just quite similar to like if you look like Israel and Palestine, you're just going to have various periods of flare-ups of violence, and nothing is going to get solved.
Because you said like, and then what it becomes a cash cow, isn't it?
Yeah.
Not for the general public. For the general public, because your country will pledge like, okay, I'm giving $200 billion. But the problem is they know that out of this 200 billion, only like we are talking about 60% will go to the Ukraine's war effort. The rest of the money will go to the military industrial complex.
Yeah, and it's just just giving a different excuse to build up your own military capabilities for no reason, because realistically, the majority of the West is not going to war.
No. But also the poor soldiers. It's like crusade again, isn't it?
And you know what's so funny is that, so I love Love Island. This is a really random segue, but I promise it'll circle back. But whenever you watch Love Island, you get army ads every single ad break. You get there are at least two. You know, the ones where like I was born in Blythe, but I was made in the Royal Navy, like that kind of thing. You get loads of those, like in the ad breaks of Love Island. And I think people genuinely don't know that if you sign up for that, that's where you're going to end up. You're gonna end up in a really dangerous situation. But the ad is just going on like, oh, come join the army. It'll be great. No, it won't. It's not going to be great. It's just scary. And it's like it's just though it's so funny because the ad appears in the middle of a Love Island break. So the target audience is young people like me who watch Love Island. And I think that's wild.
And also, you know, like who are supposed to join the army? It's just the poor people, isn't it?
It's like poor young men. That's the target audience of that.
It just history just repeats, isn't it? Again, again. It's just like in the same vicious cycle.
Yeah.
It's just like, you know, my hope is, you know, at one point, you know, we might break it a bit, you know.
I have hope that it will, because obviously it seems like it's never changing, but things do change. Just really, really slowly.
So, but at the same time, the way things are, it's just almost unsustainable now. You know, the climate problem, you know, the war problem. I mean, people's lives are totally destroyed, you know. It's just not life we are talking about, you know. The life, you know, the gift. Because you just live for your day-to-day thing, you know, like just feel nothing else. It's quite sad way to live this gift. I mean, special.
And I'm fighting for my life, trying to find a job.
You can see
all I want.
Yeah. You know? Because, I mean, you know, these things, you know, access to education, access to jobs, this should be given, isn't it?
Yeah, it should be easy.
Like super rich people, you can see like they're not worried about jobs.
No, but everyone my age is.
So that's the public, isn't it? That's the mass.
Yeah.
And these are so important for our well-being, for our, you know, dignity, for our, like everything, being a human being. And if you are taking away and then focusing on something which is just like, you know, just stupid thing to do, I mean.
You circle back to that like cognitive dissonance where people don't even associate the fact that the government is pushing money in to manage the conflict in Ukraine with the fact that the money that you don't see in your bill that's like your tax, that's what that is. You know, it's not like people. I think people have this idea that, I mean, tax, nobody thinks about the tax because obviously here it's pre-calculated anyway. It's just you don't touch it and it's not yours, but it is yours. And that's what it's doing, you know, that's where it is. And it's just that people have this complete disconnect from politics with a big P and then like your everyday life. Like there's just no concept that you actually have such a significant stake in all of it because you are funding it. Whether or not you want to be, you are.
Another like frightening statistic is, you know, like the tax evasion. So like through tax evasion, the world created something called tax haven. And in that tax haven, there's like $33 trillion sitting there.
Yeah. Yeah. I've seen that.
Like for what? I mean,
nobody knows.
But also there's no question asked that, I mean, because states should do something about that, isn't it?
Yeah, they should, but they won't.
Because our states are fighting for, you know, justice and then all those.
Yeah, but then the problem is our states are run by the richest people in the states. That's the nature of the game. Most politicians are millionaires. Most of them, if they're career politicians, by the end of their career will be millionaires. Most members of cabinet, if they're not millionaires, they almost certainly will be.
Yeah.
I mean, our prime minister, he's the richest prime minister we have ever had. He's one of the richest people in the country. So he has no reason to go after he has no reason to go after tax evasion of the wealthy and tax havens because it doesn't benefit him. All of our politicians tend to be quite wealthy, so it's just one of those things.
I mean, there's a funny story. Like, do you know, like Michael Moore? I mean, he did documentary, something called
Yeah, I know the name.
Fahrenheit 9/11. So during the Iraq War, he actually went to all those, congressmen, all those lawmakers home, knocking the door with a like piece of paper and asked them, "Will you sign that your son will or your daughter will join the army?" Or
Yeah.
no one signed.
No.
So like who'll die in this war, isn't it?
Yeah.
And who'll make money from this war?
Not us.
No,
We're not making.
there's nothing to do with Americans, the mass population. Or obviously the Iraq was in that, receiving end. They were destroyed.
Yeah.
It's the whole thing is just like so bad. And like when the whole populace kind of accept that position, that makes me so, disappointed.
And it's one of those things that it's funny because the more I get into education and the higher in education I get, the angrier I get at things. But I know the only reason I'm angry is because I know so much about the situation. And most people don't know, so they're not as angry as I am. And I'm just sitting here full of rage and with nowhere to put it.
So pick up the most vulnerable people in the world and then, go after them.
Yeah.
Rather than, who are putting $33 trillion, which can solve everything of the world. If you add like 8 trillion, the America wasted for war on terror, and the 33 trillion, that's like over $40 trillion,
Like, I don't even know how much money that is. I think that would end poverty. I think that would actually do it.
I mean, that will end everything,
Yeah.
If you ask a millionaire, do you care about your country? He says, no.
No.
I want to go to Spain for shopping.
Yeah.
I don't have time for this bullshit, That's the reality, isn't it? That's the actual things happen in our names. Jayne, I mean, thank you so much. I think it's such a joy to talk to you about these things. And now I think you are becoming a practitioner, and I think I need to come back to you again and again, and then have this great conversation, positive conversation, and then the way actually we can change, we can a kind society, compassionate society. We can all live together,
Yeah.
We just need our money back. Just give me 1 million, from that 40 trillion.
Problems would be solved,
I can take care of myself, You don't need to worry about me. You don't have to protect me. You don't have to make my country secure,
Yeah, I'll be fine,
I'll be absolutely fine, So, Jayne, thank you so much, and good luck for your dissertation.
Yeah, it was nice to talk to you.
So I'll come back to you again and again, because I was planning to touch some of the Northern Ireland, but we touched so many things, more serious stuff. So I think you can come back. So once you visit,
no, I'm happy to do it again with Northern Ireland. I love talking about it.
Okay, so you take care of yourself. Okay. Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye. It was lovely talking to you.
Thank you.